During World War II, American tank crews duked it out with Nazi Panzers in a high-explosive duel to the death. Crammed inside 30 tons of rolling steel, the GIs went up against a better armed and more experienced enemy. All too often, the tank became a steel coffin. It was a war where survival demanded a good crew, a lot of guts, and a lot of luck. Meet the tank crews, next on Suicide Missions. The tank that put the teeth into an American armored division in World War II was known officially as medium tank M4. But to the 5 GIs that manned each of these steel monsters, it's better remembered as the General Sherman. The crews hoped that their Sherman would live up to its Civil War namesake, cut a path through hostile territory, and leave in its wake a defeated enemy. The Sherman was conceived not too many years earlier, before America was even at war, as a weapon intended to help the infantry out of a tight spot. It was supposed to roll in and blast away at machine gun nests, enemy troops, and other soft targets. But on the battlefields of Europe, the Sherman was forced to take on a much deadlier job, shooting it out, point blank, with enemy tanks.
Everybody was frightened, everybody was scared, but it got built into you. You know, this is what you were going to do, and you were going to see it through, one way or another.
What are you going to do? You're going to repel and try and just refuse to get back in? You just didn't do it.
Every day you would just say, man, if I can just make it through today, I got it made. But that came up every day.
Every time we got into a tank, it was suicide in a sense that we could have been killed at any time and we knew it. But at the same time, I think we all felt that we were still somewhat invincible.
During the war, the American Army fielded 16 different armored divisions. They were outfitted with a mix of 2 types of tanks: a small tank named the General Stuart and the heavier Sherman tank. Only 2 of those 16 divisions, the 2nd and the 3rd, were designated as heavy armored divisions, meaning that their regiments were equipped primarily with Shermans. A heavy armored division was made up of 3 regiments, 2 armored regiments, and a regiment of mechanized infantry, plus field artillery, medical staff, supply people, signals people, reconnaissance units, combat engineers, and a maintenance battalion. Altogether, nearly 14,000 men. Placed bumper to bumper, their vehicles would stretch for almost 10 miles. But a heavy armored division's combat power, its reason for being, was its 232 Sherman tanks. The 3rd Armored Division had been formed back in the spring of 1941. In camps across the United States, the men spent almost 2 years learning the technology and the tactics of armored warfare and how to work together as a team. Once in England, they trained for 10 more months and prepared themselves for the invasion of Europe. They came ashore at Omaha Beach in Normandy, France in late June 1944, 3 weeks after D-Day. And on the morning of June 29th, the men of the 3rd Armored Division got their baptism of fire. They attacked the Germans dug in around Villiers-Foussard, a small village in the French Hedgerow country. In the dense tangle of trees and narrow roads, the American tankers came face to face with the big German tanks with guns described by one GI, the size of telephone poles. The German Mark IV and the 53-ton Mark V Panther tanks, with their high-velocity 75mm guns, made mincemeat of the Shermans. The German armor-piercing shells punched through one side of the Sherman and straight out the other. In the maelstrom of close combat, tanks were quickly knocked out, blown to pieces, or set ablaze, incinerating the trapped men. An intense artillery barrage forced the German defenders into retreat, and the Americans won the battle. But the tankers had suffered a terrific beating. Belton Cooper was a 25-year-old ordnance officer in the 3rd Armored Division, tasked with recovering and replacing the battle-damaged tanks.
All morning long, they started bringing in these tanks with these broken and twisted bodies inside, and I was absolutely devastated. I thought, Cooper, how in the hell are we going to win this war? The Germans are shooting the hell out of these tanks. I mean, that's the first time I seriously doubted if we could win this war. The Germans were just devastating us. They would just slaughter us right and left.
At the end of its first day of the war, the 3rd Armored Division had lost 351 men and 31 tanks. The relentless power of the German tanks had caught the American crews off guard. They were clearly outgunned by the Panzers of Hitler's Third Reich.
I was frightened, I was terrified. Sometimes I cried, sometimes I prayed. It really got to me. I was mad too. I could see how in the world the American army could put our soldiers on the field of battle with those gross infantry tank. And I just didn't know how we were going to get through the war.
I was angry at people that I didn't know who they were, but it was people who I had expected would, with the ability of the American resources, build the best tank in the world.
The American tankers had learned an unexpected lesson. Their Sherman was not the best tank, as they had been led to believe. The first confrontation with Nazi tanks in Normandy, France in June 1944 proved to the tankers of the American Armored Force that their M-4 Sherman was no match for the enemy tanks. Too many Shermans and too many trained crewmen had been lost in the fight.
It was really a policy that was adopted at the beginning of the war that caused the loss of these soldiers. It was a matter of the American government chose production over research and development and made production paramount.
Research and development of new tanks became a low priority for the U.S. Army at the end of World War I. In 1920, Congress passed the National Defense Act, which reorganized a post-war army and abolished the fledgling tank corps. Innovation virtually came to a standstill. The only new ideas came from an eccentric inventor named Walter Christie. In this 1931 film, a radical Christie design is put through its paces for the Army brass. Christie's secret was a unique suspension that transformed the tank into something like a sports car with a cannon. But the Army's response was less than enthusiastic.
The Army had a lot of problem dealing with him because he was eccentric and he insisted on everything being his way, and the Army couldn't modify or change it. And eventually they just gave up dealing with him.
Frustrated by the Army's indifference, Christie took his ideas to Europe. Ironically, Many of the German tanks that the U.S. Army would come up against in World War II sported a Christie-style suspension. Left without a tank corps to supervise the development of armored fighting vehicles, the infantry and the cavalry branches designed their own tanks. The infantry looked at tanks as weapons that should support riflemen on the assault. They needed to be maneuverable and pack a lot of firepower. In 1939, the infantry settled on a tank called the M2 Medium. It had a crew of 6, no less than 8 .30 caliber machine guns, and a short-barreled 37mm cannon in a top turret. The cavalry, on the other hand, had considered its traditional roles in scouting and pursuit and put its money in lighter, faster tanks. They were armed with either machine guns or, in later models, a 37mm cannon. The light tanks required just 4 crewmen. Harley Swinson drove a light tank.
At the time, we had just shoe signals on our shoulders and stuff, you know. You didn't have a radio contact. It was mostly manual contacts for driving and backing up, right or left. When they wanted you to stop, they'd give you one good rap, you know. You know you were supposed to stop.
On September 1st, 1939, the Germans surprised the world with the power of their blitzkrieg attack on Poland. Compared to the German Panzers sweeping across Europe, the American tanks back home looked like toys. On July 10, 1940, the Army created the Armored Force and immediately began to play catch-up. Army planners needed a new tank, and fast. Tank builders at Chrysler wanted to replace the small 37mm of the M2 Medium with a larger 75mm cannon already in the inventory. But they hadn't yet figured out how to mount that big gun in a rotating turret. So they kept the 37mm gun in the top turret and mounted the larger 75 in a sponson on the side of the tank. Called the M3 Medium, the new tank made its spectacular public debut in April 1941 at Chrysler's giant Detroit tank arsenal. The M3 went to war with the British and U.S. armies fighting the Germans in North Africa. They found that since the 75mm gun had a very limited traverse, it was difficult to aim. The whole vehicle had to be moved to align the gun on a target, and that cost precious time in the heat of battle. But the M3 was only a stopgap. Before it was even in combat, the Army Ordnance Department was working on a new tank with the 75mm gun in a top turret. A turret that could traverse 360 degrees. In October 1941, this design was standardized as medium tank M4 and would become known as the Sherman. The first Sherman rolled off the assembly line in February 1942. Soon, tanks would be coming off the line at a rate of 2,000 a month. Chrysler's Detroit tank arsenal was the major builder of the tank, but other manufacturers like the American Locomotive Company, Ford, and the Pullman Car Company also built Shermans. The Sherman had a 5-man crew. The driver and an assistant driver worked in the hull. The loader, the gunner, and the commander worked in the turret. For them, the tank's real beauty was its simplicity.
The Sherman tank was manned by farm boys that had been used to working with tractors and that sort of thing. When they sat down in the seat where we are right now, they weren't at a loss because mechanics had been a major part of their life. The problem in a tank is this: there's so much equipment jammed inside of this hull that what you find in it is a super tight, confined quarters that get very hot and very dirty very fast. And at full power, particularly if this tank was buttoned up, that is, the hatches down, the noise would be so much that you could barely hear yourself scream.
The first Shermans out of the factory were shipped overseas to outfit British armored units fighting the Germans in North Africa. In their first combat in September 1942, the British knocked out some enemy tanks and lost a couple of Shermans. The fight ended more or less in a draw. The first Shermans in U.S. hands met the enemy in Tunisia on December 6, 1942. A company of 5 tanks from the 2nd Armored Division attacked German tanks and anti-tank gun positions. All 5 Shermans were destroyed. By the time the U.S. Army was fighting the Germans in Sicily and Italy, it was clear the M-4 Sherman was outclassed. Its 75mm cannon had a low muzzle velocity. The speed at which the shell left the barrel was too slow to punch a hole in the thick German armor. The men shared stories of watching their shells harmlessly bounce off Nazi tanks. The German guns, however, with their higher muzzle velocity, easily riddled the Shermans. With a weak gun and thin armor, the Sherman was a death trap. The unavoidable compromise that builders of the U.S. M-4 Sherman had to make between firepower, protection, and mobility would become even more obvious as the Allied forces came ashore in Normandy, France. During the summer of 1944, the Sherman crews would suffer considerably. The French farm country, just inland from the D-Day invasion beaches, was a patchwork of small fields bordered by dense mounds of dirt, roots, and trees. These so-called hedgerows made perfect hiding places for the German defenders. Their weapon of choice was the Panzer Faust. This German invention fired a warhead called a shaped charge. When it hit, the energy of the explosion would focus to a point, and the hot jet would melt through the armor in a split second. In this German training film, the weapon penetrates nearly 5 inches of steel, twice the thickness of the Sherman's frontal armor.
You wouldn't think with a little hole as small as that to where it went through that it could do all the damage it did inside of a tank. But when it blew out inside, it just tore up everything.
The Panzer Faust was similar, but far superior to the American bazooka. It didn't have the range of the bazooka, but that didn't matter in the hedgerow country. But the most lethal anti-tank weapons in Normandy were the German Panther tanks with their high-velocity 75mm guns and the bigger Tiger tanks with 88s.
The Germans with their 88s could pierce the front armor here if it hit at the right angle, travel through the compartment and right out the back.
July 11th, 1944 was one of the most critical days in the Battle of Normandy. The Germans launched a massive counterattack near the town of St. Lo. Sherman tanks from the 3rd Armored Division moved forward to repel the onslaught. The American tankers soon found themselves overwhelmed. Walter Stitt was 20 years old and a gunner.
The lieutenant came over and ordered the tank commander to get out of the tank, said he was going to take over. And found out later the lieutenant had already lost 2 tanks that day, and this was his 3rd tank. And so he got in, and we were sitting still, and all of a sudden the platoon sergeant started yelling over the phone, said, "Lieutenant, they're shooting at you, back up, back up." Then the sergeant got on him again, said, "Lieutenant, back up, back up." And I looked, and he just was paralyzed, and he reached over and he grabbed his mic button and pushed the button and said, "Driver, back up." And bang, just like that, was hit, and the shell hit right in front of the gunner and killed the gunner and the tank commander both. And of course, then survival gets in. You said, "I got to get out of here and get out of here fast, because if they hit me once, they'll get me again."
Chuck Miller was also 20 and a loader. This, too, was his first experience in combat. His commander and gunner were killed by a direct hit almost immediately.
You shouldn't, but you just lose it all there for a minute there. You just don't know what's going on, and all you can think about is getting out of the tank.
By July 16th, reinforcements had helped repel the German offensive at St. Lo. By then, the division had lost 87 tanks. Bert Close was 19. His tank company lost 12 of its 16 tanks.
The strategy of sending tanks up roads, one behind the other, where there was no maneuverability, was terrible. One way or the other, they were just sitting ducks.
23-year-old Clement Elizondo was a gunner.
There was several bad mistakes made. One, we went in with no infantry. We had plenty of infantry units around, so I don't know what happened, but it was a pretty bad mistake.
I was totally disgusted both with the Sherman tank and with the people who were making the decisions on how to use it. I thought, what kind of fools do they take us for?
The Army had never before experienced this kind of warfare in this kind of terrain. Every day in the hedgerows, the armored warriors learned a costly lesson. If they could break out of Normandy and the tangle of hedgerows, they would hit flat, open country. Better country for maneuvering tanks. They tried by fitting a handful of Shermans with bulldozer blades. The tank dozer would knock down the hedgerow, and other tanks would rush into the breach. But this had a serious drawback. The Germans soon learned that wherever the tank dozer was, that was where the breakthrough was going to happen. The Germans then concentrated their fire at those points with murderous effect. A sergeant named Curtis Cullen of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron came up with a remarkable solution. He took scrap iron girders and welded them to the front of a tank's hull. On July 22nd, a tank commanded by 31-year-old Albert Genest was fitted with Cullen's iron tusks for a secret demonstration for the Army brass.
I was set up there with my crew, and we got in position and we got the order to hit it. And we hit it, and we went through, and we went back to the bivouac. That's about how long it lasted.
Cullen's device, called the hedge chopper, or the Rhino, became an instant hit. The 3rd Armored Division commander wanted 57 of his tanks fitted with the hedge choppers by the next morning. The task of mass producing the device fell to the division maintenance crews.
Well, they had to make a different hedge chopper for each tank because the parts were all different. We just cut up parts and tried to put them together the way we could. So the individual men had to improvise and design their own hedge chopper. We'd have one guy cutting up the steel, one crew was fitting the steel together, another crew would come and weld it out.
Maintenance men worked around the clock, cutting and fitting the hedge choppers. They were racing to rig as many tanks as possible in time for Operation Cobra, the upcoming Allied attempt to break through the German lines. The big attack was scheduled to begin the next morning.
We found out it took 40 man-hours of labor to weld up a hedge chopper. And we only had 40 men, we only had 7 hours to go. So we worked all night long, worked our butts off, but instead of 57 hedge choppers, we had 7 the next morning. That's all we had. But fortunately, the good Lord looked after us, and the storms and the rain and the weather was so bad that the Air Force had delayed the attack for 3 days. Well, in 3 days, we got about half of them on there ready to go. We never had the 57, but we got about half of them, about 25 or so. And that was the thing that really saved the day.
After the weather cleared on July 25th, a combination of air power, artillery, infantry, and armor broke the German lines. Enemy containment collapsed, and the Allied armies hurtled into the heart of France. The 3rd Armored Division moved 17 miles in 2 days and lost only 2 tanks.
It was the best single innovation that I know of that improved the capability of the Sherman tank. And in fact, I think without the hedge shot, I don't think we'd have gotten out of Normandy. I think we'd have been bogged down there. I don't think we could have really broken out.
For his invention of the hedge chopper, Sergeant Cullen received the Legion of Merit. And the Sherman crews got a new lease on life. It was during the pitched battles to break free of the French Hedgerows that the crews of the American M-4 Sherman discovered its greatest deficiencies. The 75mm gun was too weak, and at just 2.5 inches, the armor was too thin. The Sherman's hull was penetrated so easily that both the enemy and the crews themselves took to calling the tank a Ronson, an allusion to the American cigarette lighter that was advertised as always lighting the first time. The tankers often added their own armor. Steel plates, called applique armor, were welded over vulnerable spots. Spare steel tracks, sandbags, and even logs were slung on the tank in an attempt to break up the searing blast of the Panzerfaust. By the summer of 1944, improved Shermans had begun to arrive in quantity. Upgraded Shermans like the M4 A3E8 or EZ8, with its thicker armor, better suspension, and a safer way to store ammunition was a welcomed addition. But the most appreciated improvement was the new 76mm gun. Although the shell was just a scant millimeter wider than the 75, the propellant capacity of the casing was about 50% greater. That gave the shell a much higher muzzle velocity and a better chance of penetrating German armor. But the armored warriors had improved their chances of survival not by just improving the tank. They had also improved the way they used the tank. Tankers learned to attack with the support of not just infantry, but with artillery and air power. This new way of fighting as a team came to be called combined arms warfare. Oftentimes, aviators from the Army Air Corps traveled with the tanks to help coordinate the attack.
We had a liaison assigned to each company from the Air Corps, and they had a special radio where they could talk to their pilots. And he rode right along with us and communicated with airplanes when we were getting their support. And it was really good when you'd see one of those P-47s dive right ahead of you, and you'd hear a big bomb boom, and you knew, rest assured, when you got up there was going to be a tank laying on its side there.
The Allied armies, with the 3rd Armored Division often in the van, used combined arms to great advantage as they swept across northern France. They had become a veteran fighting team, well-versed in the art of armored warfare.
The hardest thing I had to do was to shoot somebody. You know, that's just entirely foreign to the way you've been raised, is to shoot and kill somebody. And so the first few times that you step on that trigger, knowing that you're really trying to kill somebody, it was really difficult. But after you've been in combat for a while, you see other men killed. You begin to get the feeling it's going to be me or them, and if it's got to be that way, it's going to be them and not me.
For all its problems, the Sherman had one beloved asset: reliability. The men who fought the tank appreciated its simple, dependable, rugged design. And so did the men who fixed them. A well-trained mechanic was worth his weight in gold to a mechanized army on the move. Repairs were made as close to the front as possible to help maintain the momentum of the offensive.
The ordnance units in Europe were pushed farther forward than anyone thought was possible, and these units were pushed right up behind the front lines, and sometimes with shifting front lines, they were the front lines.
Tanks knocked out in combat were picked up by giant recovery trucks and brought back to a secure rear area called a Vehicle Collection Point, or VCP. The first step in repairing a tank often proved to be the most difficult: removing the mangled bodies of the dead crewmen.
These tanks were coming to that VCP, they were just shot all to hell. I mean, you couldn't believe it, and the bodies are still in there, and we had to get the bodies out. If a guy gets hit in the head just explodes, the brains and everything just go over the tank. It's horrible. The brains get all down the turret race and then the electrical wiring and the harness, and you just have to rip all that stuff out and clean it out thoroughly. Then after they do that, to replace the harness and to paint the tank all over inside. And even after you paint it, there's that still faint stench of death that comes through that paint. You're not sure, but it's always there.
Shot-up tanks could be fixed, but experienced crewmen were lost for good. Once in combat, it became virtually impossible to get trained replacement crews. New crewmen were trained in a matter of days, sometimes not at all.
I remember once getting a replacement. I asked the guy his name and got that, and I said, what kind of training did you get? He says, infantry. I said, did you go to Fort Knox? No. I says, have you been in a tank before? And he said, no. I said, oh my God. I said, what are you doing here? Well, we were lining up to move out, and so I put the kid in the assistant driver's seat. The next thing you know, a few shells came in. This kid gets hit, but not bad. In fact, I don't even know how bad it was. And he took off on me because we hadn't gone far. Took off running. I still, to this day, don't know his name. I never saw him again, and I never found out what happened, but that was war.
Now, later on, we began to lose so many men that we had to operate with a three-man crew. We had a driver and a tank commander and a gunner. So then they sent down 2 truckloads of raw recruit infantrymen. They brought them down, we lined them all up, said, how many of you guys have ever operated a tank? None of them have been in a tank. Some of them have never seen a tank before, not close up. So we got them out there, so we took them and divided them into crews. And so we took a tank driver and 2 men, put them in a tank. We let each man fire 3 rounds apiece. That's the only training they had on that gun. That's all they had first time. And about 5 o'clock that night, we released them, and going out about 8 o'clock that night, 3 hours later, out of that 17 tanks, 15 were knocked out alongside the road. And I don't know whether any of those young guys survived or not. They had no idea what they were getting into. And I thought, how in the hell can you send these kids? But there was nobody else to send. That was it.
By the end of August, the 3rd Armored Division had moved out of northern France and through the cities of Mons and Liège, Belgium, on their way to Germany. Major General Maurice Rose, 3rd Armored Commander, had pushed his division farther and faster than anyone thought possible. The autumn rains had turned the European countryside into a quagmire. The tracks had to be fitted with special extended end connectors called duck bills to help the tanks move through the mud. On September 12th, a reconnaissance platoon of the 3rd Armored had crossed from Belgium into Germany and occupied a small border town. For the first time since the Napoleonic Wars, a German town had fallen to an invading army. The soldiers of the 3rd Armored, the 2nd Armored, the 4th Infantry, and a host of other divisions wasted no time in assaulting the Siegfried Line, the complex network of German bunkers and defensive fortifications. From now on, Hitler's soldiers would be defending their home turf, and for them, no sacrifice would be too great to blunt the spearhead of the armored warriors. The American armored and infantry divisions cleared a path through the vaunted Siegfried Line by the fall of 1944. Even though German resistance was stiff, it looked like the Allies could end the war by Christmas. But on December 16th, the German army launched a massive counterattack and drove a deep wedge between the Allied forces. They hit with everything they had. The American Air Force couldn't fly in the lousy weather, and the tankers found themselves fighting for their lives.
You know, you keep wondering how much longer it can go on, or am I going to get it tomorrow, or, you know, what's going to happen?
You get to where it's a survival of the fittest, and if you're lucky, you make it.
I think there was a time when I felt that I could have died, and that would have been all right. I wrote to my folks once when I thought maybe that time was coming, but I did tell them that they should know that if I am killed, that I got more Germans, or more Jerrys, than would ever even up by getting me.
The Ardennes offensive, the so-called Battle of the Bulge, was without a doubt the armored warriors' most desperate and miserable fight.
He would lose a tank and see his crew shot all to hell, and then get back in a tank and still fight it, lose that one and lose another, and he kept going. We've had some that lost 3 and 4 and 5 tanks and still kept fighting. Those men were courageous. The bravest men I ever saw.
They were determined to hold their ground, and with the return of clear skies, they once again enjoyed the full support of American air power. The Allies attacked, and by February 1945, the 3rd Armored Division had finally reoccupied the area around the German towns of Aachen, Stolberg, and Mausbach, the region it held before the Bulge. In mid-February, the division tankers received an answer to their prayers. The Army's first heavy tank. Called the M26 Pershing, it was a radical new design, conceived from the very start as a tank killer. Built by the Detroit and Grand Blanc tank arsenals, it was armed with an incredibly powerful 90mm gun. It had a very low silhouette, with armor up to 4.5 inches thick, and a torsion bar suspension system reminiscent of what Walter Christie had tried to get the Army to adopt more than a decade earlier. The M26 more than made up for the deficiencies of the Sherman. By the end of February, 200 Pershings had been issued to the various armored units. The 3rd Armored Division got 10 and wasted no time in putting them to use. Within a week, the new heavy tanks were leading the division to its next objective in Germany, the once grand city of Cologne. Clarence Smoyer was a gunner leading the way in one of the new Pershings.
We finally moved ahead more, and I remember one of the lieutenants got on the phone and he said, "Gentlemen, I give you Cologne. Let's knock the hell out of it."
A Signal Corps photographer, Tech Sergeant Jim Bates, tagged along with the division as it rolled into Cologne. His film footage captured the extremes of the armored war, the vulnerability of the Sherman, and the power of the new Pershing. His images are some of the most dramatic and gut-wrenching of the entire war. In this shot, a Sherman has just been hit. A crewman, his foot severed in the attack, falls and bleeds to death. The Pershing crew spots the enemy tank, a Mark V Panther, moving behind a building. The cameraman moves ahead and continues filming as the M26 stalks its prey.
So we started to fire into that building, which he was aside of. I thought maybe if we fire armor-piercing shells, they would go through the building and maybe still get him, you know. But evidently he just kept on backing up and went all the way down to the cathedral.
The German tank moves into the plaza of the Grand Cathedral. The Pershing pursues. Smoyer spots his target and opens fire.
I fired first shell on the run, hit him, and then we stopped and fired another one.
The German driver is killed. The commander and the gunner bail out. Smoyer fires a third time. The concussion from his gun rots the camera. Ammunition set off by the shell turns the Panther into a funeral pyre. It sat and burned for 3 days.
I didn't go back and look in that afterward because I knew some of them died in there, and I spent a lot of time wondering if any of them survived, you know. It still hurts, you know. Even though they were the enemy, they're still humans.
In 2 months, Germany would surrender and the war in Europe would be over. Because of its zeal to lead the way, the 3rd Armored Division was officially dubbed the Spearhead Division. But being the vanguard came with a price. The 3rd Armored lost 648 of its tanks in combat, and another 700 were damaged in action. It also suffered more battle casualties than any other armored division. 10,371 men killed, wounded, or missing, including its commander, Major General Maurice Rose. He was killed in action near Paderborn, Germany, just weeks after the assault on Cologne. During the war, Harley Swinson escaped from 3 tanks, and so did Walter Stitt. Bert Close bailed out of 4, and Clement Alessandro had survived the loss of 5 Shermans. And thanks to his job of having to account for all the battle-damaged tanks, Belton Cooper holds the distinction of seeing more destroyed Shermans than any man alive.
I said, what a terrible thing war does to a young man. It takes him in the prime of his life. It demeans him, it humiliates him, it destroys the last vestige of human dignity. You have no dignity in the army or the war at all. And I said sometimes it kills him or horribly maims him, and those of us that survive are never quite the same.